Welcome to Tour with the Roses. Today we have donned our safety masks and traveled to the lonely site, one of my favorite sites, called Capernaum, or in Hebrew we call it Kfar Nahum. And this is one of my favorite sites because it is a great documentation of early believers in the land of Israel. We'll get into that as we explore the site and its significance in the Bible and in the teaching ministry of Jesus. So here we go. We are going to tour with the roses here in Kfar Nahum. Welcome to Capernaum. This is a town that's mentioned quite a bit in the New Testament. I'm just going to read you an example from Luke 4:31. It says, "And he went down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and he was teaching them on the Sabbath." Now, this site is a very large site. It's been excavated since the 1860s. And most of that work has been done by the Franciscan order who controls this site. What makes it special is that there was a house here where Jesus often stayed. It was even referred to as his house. It's actually the house of Peter's mother-in-law, and we're going to look at it. Now, there are a bunch of miracles that Jesus did here in the town of Capernaum, or in Hebrew we call it Kfar, meaning village, Nahum, the village of Nahum. And I want to point out, first of all, what the houses would have looked like back in those days. This is a residential neighborhood that we're looking at. And here you can see a standard 4-room house. They're actually relatively small. There's usually a courtyard associated with them. And inside these small squares, they would have 4 rooms. Often they would also have a second floor, but not always. And you can tell based upon where the pillars are if there was a second floor. And inside these houses, you would have a living area and probably some kind of storage area as well as sleeping chambers. And they would often do the cooking and whatnot outside in the courtyard. And they would have these rectangular houses with cross beams going across, held up by either wooden or stone pillars, and then a thatched roof on top. That explains why we had this story in the New Testament about the paralytic man, and his friends took him on a stretcher of some sort or on a bed mat, and they wanted to get in, but they couldn't get in. That was here in Capernaum. And they made a hole in the roof. How did they do that? They dug through the thatched roof. And that works perfectly well with all the other residential buildings that we found here. And you can see there are a lot of residential buildings. This site, by the way, I don't know what it is in terms of the English equivalents, but according to the European standard, it's called a dunam. So there are 1,500 dunams of residential area of city that they've marked out here. It tells you just how big this place is. It's actually really quite large, and we're only looking at part of it. A lot of it has been excavated, certainly not all of it. Some of the excavations are done here in the Franciscan section. And then across on the other side of that wall, the Orthodox Church also has a huge plot of territory, and they've been excavating there as well, though not as much as the Franciscans here. The Franciscans excavated 2 incredible finds. One of them is the site right behind you. This is the synagogue. We'll talk about that. And the other is what they believe is the site of Peter's mother-in-law's house. In Matthew 8, verse 5, it says, "When he entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, appealing to him, and Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly." And to summarize the story, he asked Jesus not to come, but just to give the command, because he had the faith to believe that Jesus could heal without being present. And Jesus marveled at this man's faith, saying, "Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith." May we all have the faith like this centurion to believe that God can do miracles. I sometimes wonder where this happened in the city of Capernaum. Was it near the synagogue, or was it near a house in some kind of a square? I tend to believe that maybe it was near this synagogue. So let's go to the synagogue and learn a little bit more about it. All right, so now we're at the synagogue. And one of the first things I want to point out is that we have a white stoned synagogue on top of a base that's made of basalt rock. And you'll notice if you look down, it's not exactly built evenly. See, it's built on top of something else. Now, this synagogue is not from the time of Jesus. It's probably most likely from the 5th century. Archaeologists say that because they found 26,000 coins from the 5th century. That's a pretty good estimate that this was built later. And like a lot of the structures that were built during the Byzantine period of time, they were generally reusing synagogue stones from other locations and transporting them. And a bright white synagogue with incredibly elegant carvings on it would stand out in a city that's made mostly of basalt rock. As a result, I think this was done mostly for decoration. And because it doesn't sit quite evenly on the foundation, they believe there was probably something under here, something very large, a public building. Back in those days, most of the public buildings were synagogues, so that's not definitive. But most likely, it makes sense that there would have been a synagogue here because this is the highest point of the topographical map in this area, and that means that generally that's where they would put the synagogue. The big public building would be on the highest point, and everything else would be around it so that it would stand out, easy to recognize, easy to find when you're traveling on the road. As a result, they think that there's a synagogue under here. That's important for us because when we read this, when we look at the topography, we look at what Jesus's mother, or Peter's mother-in-law's houses, where Jesus often stayed, we can see just how close they were to a synagogue, and that's part of the story I want to share today. So as we enter the synagogue, one of the first things you'll notice is that it's really quite large. This is the size of a synagogue you might expect to see in the 5th century, but not the kind of size that you would expect to see during the 1st century. And so that's one of the first clues that it is definitely not original from that period. So they're very ornate, they're very beautiful. They weren't all designed here. That's how we know that it's borrowed from some other location. Of course, archaeologists have put a lot of this together. It wasn't standing just like this when we found it. They've reassembled a lot of it. It gives you an idea of what we're talking about when we're saying they repurposed a lot of these white stones from somewhere else, probably somewhere where limestone was very common, because in this particular area, we have basalt stone, which is dark and gray, not white. Now take a look at this piece of artistic interpretation. You might recognize the wheels on the bottom and what looks like some kind of a building on top. You might recall the vision that Ezekiel had of God on the throne with wheels underneath, and this sort of is an interpretation of something like that where God is present in the temple, but the temple at this point, of course, was destroyed, and so there's this longing for God's presence inside a synagogue that was built somewhere and then transported here. It's very beautiful, and it gives you an idea of the kind of art and the beauty that was inside this synagogue. Or this, which seems to indicate the two pillars from the temple. Notice the spiral columns. So here we are at the house of Peter's mother-in-law. This is the house where Jesus often spent his time. You'll notice that there's a modern church above us, which is octagonal in shape, and it sits above, directly above, an octagonal church that is ancient underneath it. Now, this church is one of the oldest octagonal churches that they've found, and as a result of that, they believe that this is the site of Peter's mother-in-law's house. The reason so is because an octagon in the ancient Roman world was a sign of a memorial for something that's special happened there, or over the site of someone who was very important who died. For example, the first octagonal shape that was used in the Roman Empire was the mausoleum of a famous emperor. As a result of that, it became a popular type of construction, so everyone knew when you saw an octagon that something special happened here. And because it's one of the oldest octagonal forms of a church, we believe, and it's in Capernaum, we believe this is the site where Jesus generally stayed. Now, that's not the first form that this house took. The first form that the archaeologists found was that it was just a regular house with a thatched roof. And then they used some Greek terminology or Latin terminology, and they called it a insula sacra, meaning a sacred place. And in that form, it became a bit larger, and the living room became bigger, and the place where they would eat became bigger. So it essentially, at that point, it had a large living room and a large meal room where they would dine together and fellowship together. And then after that, it became much, much bigger. And if we look over here at the picture, you can see how the archaeologists have determined what it looked like. You can see the second form, the third form really that it took, because this is the original house, just changed a little bit. But then in its third formation, it became a dominus ecclesia. Now, this is a common term. We would say, translate that quite simply, a house church. And what's special about it, and one of the reasons this is probably my favorite site in all of Israel, is because it shows us what life was like for the early Jewish believers. Why do I say Jewish believers? Well, this is a Jewish city. There were no Gentiles in Nahum in that period of time. Everyone around them are Jewish. And if you look at the proximity between here and the later 5th century synagogue, which also might, most likely, it's also the location of the 1st century synagogue, we can see that there's a connection, a really close proximity between these two houses of worship. And apparently it wasn't always peaceful, because in this Dominus Ecclesia, they actually built a wall around it. Archaeologists say this wall was for their protection. So they built a wall around it to keep the people inside safe. But who were they keeping them safe from? Well, they were keeping themselves safe from their neighbors. And we find that there was a conflict in the beginning of Christianity between modern Judaism and Christian followers of Jesus that were Jewish, and that conflict was generally over religious beliefs and interpretations, and all of them were fighting for power since the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, because at that point, you no longer had the temple where the priests were in charge. Now everyone, all these other groups like the Pharisees, and maybe some other smaller groups, were trying to fight over the religious life of the Jewish people, and as a result, there was fighting and there was conflict. And all of that really could date back to the Bar Kokhba rebellion, but we're not going to get into all of that. But what we see after that, the next form that this house of prayer or this house church took, it became an octagonal church in the 5th century, about the time that synagogue is built there as well. And at this point in time, we can see a lot of the structure has clearly is Christian. And when the archaeologists looked at the earliest layers, we can see that they didn't build it in the 5th century for no reason as a church. Even when it was in the Insula Sacra period, they found large serving vessels, and they even found writing on the wall which said, "Jesus is our Lord, God, Messiah," and other things that lead them to believe that the Jewish people who were living here or using this as a public building definitely believed that Jesus was not only the Messiah, but also that he was God, and they were worshiping Jesus as such here in this facility, which means that this is one of the places where Jesus was. This was his home. This was the place where he would often lay his head at night. And it's really neat to be this close. We can't touch the stones because they've been reused and built upon, but we can see this is the site where Jesus was, and it was important to him. What also makes this site very, very important is that there's no gaps. In a lot of the church history of the churches in the land of Israel, there's a site, something happened there, and then sometime in the 4th century, some Roman believers came, and they wanted to find those sites, and they started building churches on top of those sites. But this church didn't have any gaps. From the time that Jesus laid his head here until it was finally destroyed, this was a place recognized by the earliest of Christianity as the site where Jesus dwelt. So many amazing stories from the New Testament happened in Capernaum. Do you remember the story I'll read it for you from Mark chapter 9. And they came to Capernaum, and he was in the house, and he asked them, "What were you talking about on the way?" And they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all, and servant of all." I'm going to skip to verse 37. It says, "Whoever receives one child in my name receives me. And anyone who receives me receives not me, but he who sent me." And you remember there's a story about the scribes, or was it the Pharisees, that came to him and said, does your master not pay taxes? And then they said, of course he does. And he went fishing, and he just pulled a shekel out of a fish. That happened here as well. And there's a story of the paralytic man, and another man was sick. The centurion's servant was sick, and Jesus just gave the word, and he was healed. There was just so much that happened in Capernaum that it makes sense that as the place where Jesus also dwelled, that they would resurrect some kind of a structure as a memorial, not just for the house itself, but for the place where Jesus did all these amazing miracles, so many miracles that in fact later on he actually gave this condemnation of Capernaum, that if these miracles had been done in other places, they would have believed. But the people here were hard-hearted. And you may not know this, but actually in the Talmud, the people of Capernaum were called heretics. Of course, this is hundreds of years later, after the time of Jesus, because so many of them actually did come to faith. But it was, of course, later. So I'm touched by the amazing things that happened here in Capernaum, and how Jesus moved and did so much here. And when we come here, we remember that this was the place where he dwelled, right here on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. He garnered in a group of poor and needy people, like the fishermen of the area, and he showed them the truth, and he changed their lives forever. Not just because of the miracles, but because of his teaching, because of his relationship with God, which he then shared with them. And so it's very important for us as we read these scriptures and we visit these places and we share these stories with you. I want you to remember too that we have that gift now, that special gift that Jesus gave to those first disciples. He gave them that ability to have a relationship with God, a personal one-on-one relationship with God that is so precious that people were willing to die for it. So thank you for coming on this tour with the Roses. You're welcome to join us on our next tour as we explore more places that are off the beaten track or special places in the land of Israel. Just one last thing. If you have not yet signed up for our prayer letter to be in touch with us and learn more about our ministry, please go to chosenpeople.com and /pray for Jason. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Tour with the Roses.